Picture a face carved in limestone over 3,000 years ago, a face so strikingly, hauntingly beautiful that when a team of German archaeologists pulled it out of the Egyptian sand in 1912, the man who found it could barely speak. He wrote in his diary that night that words were useless, that this face simply had to be seen to be believed. Describing the moment the painted stucco and limestone finally emerged fully from the rubble, as though he had encountered, quite unexpectedly, the single most alive piece of Egyptian art he had ever laid eyes on in his entire career. Mysterious tone. That face belongs to a woman who ruled beside one of the strangest and most controversial kings in all of ancient Egyptian history. A woman who may have worn a crown of her own, who may have ruled as pharaoh in her own right after her husband's death, and who then, astonishingly, vanished from the historical record so completely that to this day, no one on earth knows for certain where her body actually rests. A disappearance so total and so strange that it has haunted Egyptologists for well over a century. Each new generation of researchers convinced they might finally be the ones to solve it, and each new generation eventually forced to admit that the sand of Egypt has kept this particular secret extraordinarily well. Before we go any further, comment down below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. And while you're there, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because the story of Nefertiti is not just the story of a beautiful face. It is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the entire history of the ancient world. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Shocking fact tone. We do not know where Nefertiti was born. We do not know for certain who her parents were. We do not know exactly when she died, how she died, or where she was buried. And yet this same woman, shrouded in almost total historical darkness, became one of the most powerful women who ever lived in ancient Egypt. A queen so central to her husband's rule that she appears in temple carvings performing rituals normally reserved only for a king, smiting Egypt's enemies with a mace raised high above her head. An image of violence and authority that female consorts in 3,000 years of Egyptian history almost never received. Bold statement tone. Her face has been reproduced more times than almost any other face from the ancient world, staring out from postcards, magazine covers, and museum posters in nearly every country on Earth, appearing on everything from academic textbooks to popular fashion imagery. An icon so thoroughly absorbed into global visual culture that many people who could not tell you a single fact about ancient Egyptian history would still instantly recognize that unmistakable blue crown and elegant, serene profile. And yet the woman behind that face remains, even now, one of the single greatest unsolved puzzles in the entire field of Egyptology. A mystery that has consumed the careers of some of the most brilliant archaeologists of the last century, without ever quite being solved. Her name, Nefertiti, means the beautiful one has come, and for more than a century, Egyptologists have been arguing about exactly where she came from, and exactly where she went. The story of Nefertiti begins somewhere around the year 1370 before Christ, though even that date is little more than an educated guess, since no birth record for her has ever been found, no tomb inscription naming her parents has ever surfaced, and no contemporary text bothers to explain who this young woman actually was before she became one of the most important figures in the entire Egyptian court. To understand the world she was born into, it helps to understand just how staggeringly wealthy and powerful Egypt had become by the time of her birth. The 18th dynasty, the royal family into which she would eventually marry, had spent generations conquering territory, extracting tribute from vassal kingdoms stretching from Nubia in the south to the edges of Mesopotamia in the north, and pouring an almost unimaginable flood of gold into the temples of Thebes, transforming the city and its priesthood of Amun into one of the wealthiest religious institutions the ancient world had ever seen. Its storehouses filled with grain, cattle, gold, and captive laborers, on a scale that dwarfed the resources available to almost any other single institution anywhere else on Earth at that moment in history. Nefertiti's future father-in-law, Amenhotep III, presided over what many historians still consider the absolute peak of Egyptian prosperity. An era of magnificent building projects, elaborate diplomatic marriages with foreign kings eager to align themselves with Egyptian wealth and prestige, and a level of luxury at court that later generations of Egyptians would remember with something close to awe, a golden age of stability and abundance that his son would inherit, and then, in the span of just a few short years, transform beyond all recognition. Reflective tone. This absence of information about Nefertiti's own earliest years is not simply an accident of poor record-keeping. It reflects something genuinely strange about how Nefertiti enters the historical stage. A silence that stands in sharp contrast to how thoroughly documented certain other members of her adopted royal family actually were. Since we know a great deal about Amenhotep III's building projects, his diplomatic marriages, and even his physical health in his final years, information preserved through decades of careful court record-keeping and monumental inscription, while his son's own future queen simply appears out of nowhere, fully formed and already at the center of events. She appears already fully formed, already married, already positioned at the very center of Egyptian religious and political life, as though history itself decided her origins were simply not worth preserving. Only her arrival at the summit of power. This gap has left the door wide open for theory after theory, and for well over a century, Egyptologists have filled that silence with competing explanations, each one built on fragments of evidence too thin to settle the question for good. The most persistent and, for a long time, the most romantic theory held that Nefertiti was not Egyptian at all, that she was a foreign princess, quite possibly from the kingdom of Mitanni in what is today northern Syria, sent to Egypt as part of a diplomatic marriage alliance the way so many foreign princesses were during this era of ancient Near Eastern politics. Bold statement tone. This theory rested almost entirely on her name itself, since the beautiful one has come sounds, to some scholars, like exactly the sort of name you would give a foreign bride arriving in a new land for the very first time, a woman whose beauty preceded her and who was now, at long last, finally here. There was even a specific candidate for this foreign identity, a Mitanni princess named Tadakhipa, who really did travel to Egypt as part of a royal marriage arrangement during this general period. This could imply, based purely on the poetic resonance of the name, that Nefertiti and Tadakhipa were one and the same woman, arriving under a new Egyptian name to begin a new life at the pharaoh's side. Shocking factone, but this theory runs into a serious, almost fatal problem the moment you actually check the historical timeline. Because Tadakhipa was not married to Nefertiti's husband at all. She had already been married, years earlier, to his father, the elderly Amenhotep III, arriving in Egypt as part of a grand diplomatic marriage alliance meant to cement good relations between Egypt and the powerful kingdom of Mitanni. Meaning that if Tadakhipa and Nefertiti really were the same person, we would have to believe that a foreign princess married into the Egyptian royal family, and was then, for reasons no surviving text explains, quietly remarried to her own stepson, taking an entirely new identity in the process. A scenario that would have represented an almost unimaginable break with Egyptian royal custom. and that no surviving diplomatic correspondence from either Egypt or Mitanni makes any mention of whatsoever. A silence that would be genuinely strange if an arrangement this unusual had actually taken place between two kingdoms that otherwise corresponded constantly and in considerable detail about every other significant matter touching their ongoing relationship. Most modern Egyptologists have rejected this theory almost entirely, not because it is impossible, but because there is simply no direct evidence to support it, and because a far more mundane, far more Egyptian explanation for Nefertiti's origins fits the surviving evidence considerably better. That more likely explanation centers on a man named A, a powerful courtier who served under Nefertiti's future father-in-law, and who would, decades later, in one of history's more extraordinary twists, actually become pharaoh of Egypt himself. Reflective tone. The evidence connecting A to Nefertiti is entirely circumstantial, built not on any document that explicitly names him as her father, but on a careful reading of the titles held by the people around her. A woman named Tay, who appears repeatedly in the historical record, carried the specific title Nurse of the Great Royal Wife, a title Egyptologists generally understood to indicate that this woman had personally raised the queen from infancy, most likely because she was the queen's own mother, or at the very least a close relative entrusted with her upbringing, since it would have been unusual, though not unheard of, for a woman with no blood connection to the queen to hold a title implying such intimate, lifelong closeness. Tay's husband was A, and A himself carried a separate title, God's Father, an honorific that some scholars believe was specifically reserved for a man whose own daughter had married the reigning or future king, a designation used elsewhere in Egyptian history in contexts that make this interpretation genuinely plausible, even if it was never applied with perfect, universal consistency across every reign in which it appears. This could imply, based on this chain of interlocking titles, that A was indeed Nefertiti's biological father, and that Tay, his wife, either gave birth to Nefertiti herself or became her stepmother and adoptive caregiver sometime during her childhood. Perhaps after an earlier, otherwise unrecorded wife of A's had died, a scenario that would explain why Tay carries the nurse title rather than being explicitly called Nefertiti's mother outright. A distinction that ancient Egyptian scribes, meticulous about titles and status, would likely not have blurred carelessly. No source directly and explicitly confirms this relationship, and no source directly contradicts it either, which is precisely the kind of frustrating, wide-open historical silence that has defined nearly every question about Nefertiti's early life. What makes the A theory particularly compelling to many historians is not just the titles themselves, but the sheer scale of A's own later career. Bold statement tone. This was not some minor provincial official whose family happened to cross paths with royalty by chance. A served as a trusted advisor across an astonishing span of Egyptian history, first appearing prominently at Akhenaten's own court, where he held military titles including Master of the Horse and Troop Leader, alongside his primary and most telling title, God's Father, continuing to wield power throughout Nefertiti and her husband's entire reign as one of Akhenaten's closest and most trusted courtiers, surviving the chaos that followed their deaths, becoming the guardian and chief advisor to the boy king who would become known to history as Tutankhamun, steering the young, inexperienced pharaoh through the delicate process of restoring Egypt's traditional religion after the trauma of the Amarna years, and finally, in the last act of an extraordinarily long and consequential life that must have spanned 6 or 7 decades by that point, ascending to the throne of Egypt himself after Tutankhamun's early and still mysterious death, ruling as pharaoh in his own right for a brief final stretch before his own death brought an entire era of Egyptian history to its close. Reflective tone. This kind of sustained, decades-spanning influence at the very center of Egyptian power is exactly the pattern historians would expect to see if A really had married his own daughter into the royal family, since a father-in-law to a queen and grandfather to her potential heirs would naturally occupy precisely this kind of protected, indispensable position at court for the rest of his life. Surviving 3, and arguably 4, complete changes in Egypt's religious and political direction without ever once losing his footing near the very center of power. If A was indeed Nefertiti's father, records connected to the family suggest her family likely came from a city called Akhmim in Upper Egypt, a provincial center with a long history and its own significant local temple traditions. A detail that, if accurate, would make Nefertiti thoroughly and completely Egyptian, born not in some distant foreign court, but within the same aristocratic circles that had produced generations of Egyptian officials before her, circles deeply embedded in the very administrative and religious institutions that her future husband would eventually work so hard to dismantle and reshape. Whatever her true origins, Nefertiti's path toward the throne began when she caught the attention of the reigning queen, a formidable woman named Tiye, wife of the aging pharaoh Amenhotep III. Mini story tone. Try to picture the calculation behind this choice. Tiye was looking for a wife for her second son, a young man named Amenhotep, who was, by the ordinary rules of succession, not even expected to inherit the throne at all, since he had an older brother, a prince named Thutmose, who was originally meant to become pharaoh and who apparently died sometime before his father. An unexpected loss that pushed the younger, less prepared son unexpectedly toward a throne he had never been specifically groomed to occupy. A twist of fate that meant the entire Amarna revolution ultimately depended on the earlier, otherwise unremarkable death of a prince most Egyptians alive at the time would barely have remembered by name a generation later. The families of Ai and Te, if the theory holds true, came from the very same region of Egypt that had produced Tiye's own family generations earlier, meaning that these two powerful households likely already knew each other well, bound together by generations of shared regional connection and mutual political interest. This could imply that Nefertiti's selection as a royal bride was not some sudden dramatic discovery of a beautiful stranger, but rather the natural, carefully considered continuation of an existing alliance between two families who had long understood the value of binding their futures together. The kind of quiet, generations-long political calculation that so often lay hidden behind the more dramatic, romanticized stories later generations like to tell about how great historical marriages actually came to be arranged. When Nefertiti and the young prince Amenhotep were betrothed, likely sometime around her 11th year, according to several historical reconstructions, based on the ordinary marriage customs of the Egyptian elite during this period. Neither of them could possibly have known that this arranged childhood engagement would eventually reshape the entire religious landscape of ancient Egypt. The exact date of their actual marriage remains, like so much else about Nefertiti's life, frustratingly uncertain. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Nefertiti was likely somewhere between 12 and 16 years old when the marriage took place, and that it happened either shortly before or shortly after her young husband ascended the throne following his father's death, with her own new husband himself probably no older than 16 to 18 at the time of his own coronation, meaning that the two teenagers who would go on to reshape the entire religious foundation of Egyptian civilization began their partnership as little more than children thrust suddenly into the most consequential positions in the entire kingdom. Vulnerability tone. It is worth pausing here to consider what this actually meant for a girl this young. Royal marriages in the ancient world were rarely, if ever, matters of personal choice, and a girl barely into her teenage years, whatever her family's status and ambition, was still stepping into a role that would define, constrain, and ultimately consume the rest of her life. Bound to a husband she likely barely knew. Entering a royal household with expectations she could only have begun to grasp. Expected almost immediately to begin producing children. To master an entirely new set of religious and ceremonial obligations. And to navigate a court environment where every other woman around her, from senior wives to ambitious concubines, had her own reasons to watch the new arrival's every move with careful, calculating attention. Whatever fear or uncertainty she may have carried into that marriage, Nefertiti would go on to become something far more consequential than a passive royal bride. She would become, within just a handful of years, one of the most visually prominent and politically significant queens in the entire 3,000-year span of ancient Egyptian civilization. The young man Nefertiti married began his reign under the name Amenhotep IV, a perfectly conventional royal name that gave no hint whatsoever of the extraordinary, deeply disruptive path he was about to take. Bold statement tone. Within just a handful of years of taking the throne, this young pharaoh would attempt something no Egyptian ruler had ever seriously attempted before. The wholesale demolition of Egypt's ancient, deeply entrenched religious system, and the elevation of a single god, the visible disk of the sun itself, known as the Aten, to a position of unprecedented and eventually near total supremacy. Nefertiti's earliest appearances in the historical record come from this initial period, before the full scope of her husband's religious ambitions had become clear, in scenes carved into the walls of tombs belonging to prominent Theban officials, including the royal butler Perennefer and the vizier Ramose, two of the most powerful non-royal figures at court during these opening years, where she is shown accompanying her husband in his role as king, a young queen standing beside a young pharaoh in the traditional, expected posture of royal consorts stretching back for centuries before her. That traditional posture would not last long. Reflective tone. Something changed, and changed dramatically, within the first several years of Amenhotep IV's reign, and historians have long debated exactly how much of that change originated with the young king himself, and how much of it may have been shaped, encouraged, or even actively driven by the young queen standing at his side. A debate complicated by the fact that Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's own father, had himself shown growing interest in solar worship and in the specific imagery of the sun disk during the final years of his own long reign, meaning that Akhenaten's later, far more radical devotion to the Aten may have built upon seeds his own father had already begun planting, rather than emerging entirely from nothing the moment he took the throne himself. This could imply, based on the sheer prominence Nefertiti achieves in religious imagery from almost the very earliest years of the new cult's development, that she was not merely a passive observer of her husband's religious transformation, but an active participant in shaping it. Though the fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence makes it genuinely impossible to say with certainty whether the initial spark for the Aten's elevation came from Akhenaten's own private convictions, from Nefertiti's influence, or from some combination of both husband and wife arriving at the same radical conclusion together. By around the 4th year of his reign, the young pharaoh began an ambitious building program at Karnak, the vast religious complex in Thebes that had, for centuries, served as the primary seat of worship for Amun, the king of the Egyptian gods. whose priesthood had grown so wealthy and so politically powerful that some historians believe they had come to rival the pharaoh's own authority. This tension between the throne and the temple had been building for generations before Akhenaten ever took power. As successive pharaohs poured tribute, captured land, and the spoils of foreign military campaigns into Amun's temples in gratitude for military victories they credited to the god's favor, until the priesthood of Amun controlled an almost unimaginable share of Egypt's total agricultural land, its gold, and its labor force, a state within a state whose high priest wielded influence that some modern historians have compared, only half-jokingly, to that of a rival monarch operating within the pharaoh's own kingdom, commanding vast estates, thousands of dependent workers, and a treasury that in some estimates may have rivaled the resources directly controlled by the crown itself. Urgent tone. Rather than simply adding another shrine to the existing complex the way countless pharaohs before him had done, Amenhotep IV constructed an entirely new set of open-air temples dedicated specifically to the Aten. Structures deliberately built without the heavy roofs that traditional Egyptian temples required, so that the sun disk itself could shine directly down upon its own worshippers, rather than being confined to the dim, incense-filled interior chambers where the older gods traditionally dwelled. Vast sunlit courtyards filled with offering tables where priests could present bread, flowers, and incense directly beneath the open sky in an entirely new style of worship that broke sharply with the dark, mysterious inner sanctuaries that had defined Egyptian temple architecture for well over 1,000 years before him. Shocking fact tone. And here is where Nefertiti's role becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because among these new temples stood one called the Doublet Benben, the mansion of the Benben stone, named for an ancient sacred stone associated since the earliest periods of Egyptian religion with the primordial mound of creation itself, the very spot where, according to Egyptian cosmology, the first act of creation had taken place at the dawn of time, a structure apparently dedicated specifically to Nefertiti herself, where surviving relief carvings show her, remarkably, without her husband standing beside her at all, performing the sacred functions of a priest entirely on her own, raising offerings directly to the Aten in a role that Egyptian religious tradition had, for the entire preceding history of the civilization, reserved almost exclusively for the reigning king. In some of these scenes, Nefertiti even appears accompanied by her eldest daughter, Meritaten, shown assisting alongside her mother in the ritual itself, suggesting that this newly elevated female religious role was intended to extend down through the generations of the royal family rather than belonging to Nefertiti alone. A family tradition of female religious authority that the royal daughters were apparently being groomed to continue long before anyone could have anticipated how urgently that tradition would eventually be needed. Since within just a few short years, questions about exactly which women in this family held genuine religious and political authority would move from quiet temple imagery into the very center of a succession crisis that would determine the fate of the entire dynasty. Bold statement tone. It is difficult to overstate how unprecedented this was. For thousands of years, Egyptian religious ideology had rested on the belief that only the pharaoh himself could serve as the essential intermediary between the human world and the divine, the single sacred conduit through which the gods and humanity communicated, a role so central to the entire theological structure of Egyptian civilization that the very stability of the cosmos was believed to depend on the king performing it correctly and consistently. To see a queen, even a queen as beloved and prominent as Nefertiti clearly was, depicted performing this role independently, without her husband present in the scene at all. represented an almost unimaginable elevation of a royal woman's religious and political status. A visual statement that Nefertiti herself possessed a kind of sacred authority that had, throughout the entire preceding history of Egyptian civilization, belonged to kings and kings alone. The religious transformation accelerated rapidly from this point forward. Around the 5th year of his reign, the young pharaoh made his intentions unmistakably clear by formally changing his own name. He abandoned Amenhotep, a name that literally honored the god Amun, meaning something like Amun is satisfied, a name that had bound him linguistically to the very god whose priesthood he was now moving deliberately to sideline, and adopted instead the name Akhenaten, meaning roughly effective for the Aten, a public, permanent declaration that his entire identity as king was now bound inseparably to this single, radiant deity. Nefertiti changed her own name as well, adding an additional title to become known as Nefertiti, a phrase meaning "beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. A beautiful woman has come," binding her own identity just as completely to the new god her husband had chosen to elevate above every other divine power in Egypt. Reflective tone. This shared renaming is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about how this royal couple understood their own partnership. They were not simply husband and wife ruling side by side in the conventional sense. They were reshaping their very names, their very identities, together around a single unifying religious vision. A level of ideological and personal fusion between a king and his queen that has few, if any, real parallels anywhere else in the entire span of recorded Egyptian history. And this same additional name, Neferuaten, would go on to carry enormous, still hotly debated significance decades later, when a mysterious co-regent bearing that very title would briefly appear at the very end of Akhenaten's reign, a connection that lies at the very heart of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in Nefertiti's entire story. In that same 5th year, Akhenaten made the decision that would define the rest of his reign and permanently reshape the historical memory of everyone associated with it. He announced that he had discovered, through what he described as divine revelation, the location of an entirely new capital city, a stretch of previously unoccupied desert roughly halfway between the old capitals of Thebes and Memphis, a site he believed belonged to no other god, untouched by centuries of worship dedicated to Amun or any of Egypt's older deities. Urgent tone. He named this new city Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, and he committed the entire resources of the Egyptian state to building it from nothing, an enormous, breathtakingly ambitious undertaking that would eventually include grand palaces, sprawling temple complexes open to the sky, and residential districts for the thousands of officials, priests, and workers who would need to relocate their entire lives to this brand new city in the middle of the desert. This astonishing speed of construction was made possible by a genuine architectural innovation that Akhenaten's builders had already begun testing back at Karnak, a standardized building block small enough for a single worker to carry and stack quickly, known today by the Arabic word talatat, roughly the size of a large loaf of bread. Bold statement tone. Traditional Egyptian temple construction relied on massive stone blocks weighing many tons apiece, requiring huge teams of laborers, complex systems of ramps and sledges, and years or even decades of patient work to complete a single major structure. The kind of monumental, generations-spanning building projects that had produced Egypt's most famous pyramids and temple complexes over the preceding 15 centuries. By switching to these small, uniform, easily portable blocks, decorated individually with fragments of relief scenes before being assembled into a larger composite image, much like pieces of an enormous stone mosaic. Akhenaten's architects could raise entire temple complexes in a fraction of the time traditional construction methods would have required. A practical engineering solution that turned out to be perfectly suited to a king in an enormous hurry to see his religious vision made real in stone before his own reign came to an end. Reflective tone. There is a certain grim irony buried in this innovation, since the very feature that allowed Akhenaten's builders to raise his temples so quickly would later make it just as easy for his enemies to tear them back down again, block by identical block, and use the pieces as ordinary building rubble for entirely unrelated construction projects elsewhere in Egypt. A fate that would indeed befall almost every structure Akhenaten and Nefertiti ever built together. Boundary stelae, enormous inscribed markers carved directly into the cliffs surrounding the site, some standing many feet tall and covered in dense hieroglyphic text, were erected to formally define the sacred limits of this new holy city, inscriptions in which Akhenaten swore, with unmistakable finality, that he would never again expand the city's boundaries beyond what he had originally decreed, and that he intended to be buried here himself when his own life eventually ended, along with his family, and, according to some versions of these inscriptions, even the sacred Nevis bull, an ancient solar cult creature associated with the city of Heliopolis. A religious tradition Akhenaten nonetheless promised would find its own resting place within his new city's boundaries. One of the few older Egyptian religious traditions his otherwise sweeping reforms chose to preserve rather than sweep away. The move to Akhenaten, known today by its modern Arabic name Amarna, represented an almost total rupture with everything that had defined Egyptian royal and religious life for well over 1,000 years. Bold statement tone. Every previous pharaoh, without exception, had ruled from cities with deep, ancient religious significance. Cities whose temples and traditions stretched back for countless generations before them. Thebes with its towering monuments to Amun, Memphis with its ancient associations stretching back to the very unification of Upper and Lower Egypt at the dawn of pharaonic history itself. Akhenaten instead built his entire reign around a city that had existed for no time at all before his own arrival. A blank slate deliberately chosen precisely because it carried no prior religious weight, no competing claims from any other god, nothing to distract from the singular, overwhelming presence of the Aten and the royal family who served as its earthly representatives. Nefertiti and her daughters moved with him to this new city, and it was here, in this strange, purpose-built desert capital, that the most extraordinary and most visually striking images of Nefertiti's power and prominence would eventually be created. Life in this new desert capital was not simply a matter of religious devotion and family portraiture. Urgent tone. Egypt in this era stood at the center of an enormous web of international diplomacy, corresponding constantly with the other great powers of the ancient Near East, the kingdoms of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, along with dozens of smaller vassal states scattered across the eastern Mediterranean coast. We know an extraordinary amount about this diplomatic world because of a remarkable cache of clay tablets discovered at Amarna itself in the late 19th century, a collection that came to be known as the Amarna Letters, hundreds of cuneiform documents written in the diplomatic language of the day, preserving actual correspondence between Akhenaten's court and foreign kings, vassal rulers, and local governors desperately pleading for Egyptian military support against invading enemies. Reflective tone. These letters paint a picture of a kingdom whose attention, at least according to some historians, had grown dangerously inward-focused during this period, with several vassal rulers in the letters expressing open frustration and alarm at how slowly, or how rarely, Egyptian military assistance actually arrived in response to their increasingly desperate pleas for help. One ruler of a small city-state on the Levantine coast reportedly writing letter after letter begging for even a token force of Egyptian archers to help hold off encroaching enemies. Pleas that, as far as the surviving record shows, went largely unanswered, as though the pharaoh's court, consumed by the demands of building an entirely new capital city and reshaping the religious foundations of the entire kingdom, had less attention left over for the messy, ongoing business of holding its foreign territories together. This could imply, based on the tone of genuine desperation running through several of these surviving letters, that Akhenaten's religious revolution came at a real cost to Egypt's international standing. Though other historians caution that Egyptian foreign policy in this era may simply have reflected a long-standing preference for diplomatic pressure and strategic patience over the constant, costly deployment of military force, a pattern that predated Akhenaten's reign and cannot be blamed on his religious reforms alone. Reflective tone. It is worth pausing here to imagine what daily life must actually have looked like inside this radical new experiment in city building, since the surviving evidence, fragmentary as it is, paints a picture unlike anything else in the ancient Egyptian world. A city whose entire physical layout and daily rhythms had been designed from scratch around a single religious vision, rather than growing organically over centuries the way every other Egyptian city before it had. Each day, according to the artwork and inscriptions that have survived, Akhenaten and Nefertiti processed together in their royal chariots from the northern royal residence to a formal reception palace at the opposite end of the city. A daily public journey that mirrored, in careful, deliberate symbolism, the sun's own journey across the sky, transforming the ordinary business of royal transportation into a continuous, living reenactment of the very cosmic order their new religion celebrated, watched, one imagines, by ordinary residents of the city lining the processional road, workers and officials alike pausing in their daily tasks to witness this recurring spectacle of royal devotion unfold before them morning after morning. The royal family appeared constantly throughout the city's art, not as distant, unapproachable god-kings glimpsed only rarely by their subjects, but as an ever-present, endlessly repeated domestic tableau, Akhenaten and Nefertiti seated together, their daughters climbing playfully onto their laps, the rays of the Aten stretching down from the sky above to touch them all with small, delicate hands that offered the Ankh, the symbol of life, directly and exclusively to the royal couple. This intense focus on the royal family as the sole visible connection between ordinary Egyptians and their god represented, in its own way, an enormous consolidation of religious and political power into the hands of just two people. Bold statement tone. Where the old religious system had offered ordinary Egyptians access to a whole pantheon of familiar, approachable gods. Osiris, who promised a comfortable afterlife. Isis, who protected mothers and children. Bez, who guarded the household and warded off evil spirits from sleeping children. Countless local deities tied to specific towns and specific everyday concerns that ordinary Egyptians had worshipped for generations without ever needing royal permission or royal mediation. Akhenaten's new theology offered access to only one god, and that access ran exclusively through the royal family itself. Ordinary citizens could not pray directly to the Aten. They could only pray to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who would then, in theory, relay those prayers upward to the sun disk they alone were permitted to address directly. This transformed the royal couple from mere political rulers into something considerably closer to living deities in their own right. A religious and political consolidation of power so total that it is difficult to find any real precedent for it anywhere else in the entire preceding history of Egyptian civilization. Reflective tone. It is worth noting that Nefertiti's mother-in-law, the formidable Queen Tiye, did not simply vanish from the story once her son moved his court to the new capital. A continuity of family influence that stretched across 2 full generations of dramatic religious upheaval. Surviving inscriptions and tomb scenes indicate that Tiye visited Amarna at least once during these years, received there with all the ceremony due to the mother of the reigning king, evidence that whatever radical religious break her son had made with the traditions of his father's court, the family bonds connecting the old Theban establishment to the new Amarna experiment had not been entirely severed. Tiye herself had been an unusually powerful and visible queen during her own husband's reign, her name paired with his on official monuments, and her opinion evidently sought on matters of state in a manner that few earlier Egyptian queens had ever enjoyed. And this could imply that Nefertiti's own remarkable prominence within Akhenaten's court did not emerge entirely from nothing, but instead built upon a model of powerful, visible Egyptian queenship that her mother-in-law had already helped establish a generation earlier. Akhenaten himself, according to several surviving inscriptions, was credited as the author of a remarkable piece of religious poetry known today as the Great Hymn to the Aten, a lengthy composition praising the sun disk's power to create and sustain all life on earth, describing the god rising each morning to fill the world with light, setting each evening to plunge the world into a darkness compared explicitly to death itself, and then rising again the following dawn in an endless cycle of renewal. The hymn describing in vivid, sweeping language how the Aten's rays reached every corner of creation, nourishing crops in distant foreign lands as readily as those along the Nile, forming the chick inside its egg, and giving the fish in the river the very breath they needed to live. A startlingly universal vision of divine care that extended, at least in the poem's own language, well beyond the borders of Egypt itself to encompass the entire created world. Reflective tone. Whether Akhenaten genuinely composed this hymn himself in some private moment of religious inspiration, or whether it was crafted collaboratively by court scribes working from the king's own theological instructions, the poem stands as one of the most sophisticated pieces of religious literature to survive from the ancient world, and its central themes, light overcoming darkness, the singular, life-giving power of one supreme creator God, bear a resemblance striking enough to certain later religious texts, including passages from the biblical book of Psalms, that some scholars have long speculated about a possible, though genuinely unproven, line of influence connecting Akhenaten's Aten theology to the later development of monotheistic religious traditions in the wider ancient Near East. Nefertiti's visual prominence throughout this period reached genuinely startling heights. Shocking fact tone. In relief carvings from the Karnak temples of this era, Nefertiti appears in a pose that Egyptian art had, for its entire multi-thousand-year history, reserved almost exclusively for kings, gripping an enemy by the hair with one hand while raising a mace high above her head with the other. Poised to deliver the killing blow, the ancient Egyptian visual formula for a pharaoh's absolute violent dominance over the forces of chaos and Egypt's enemies. No queen before her, in the entire preceding span of Egyptian history, had ever been depicted in quite this way, wielding this specific, unmistakably kingly gesture of righteous violence, with such confident, unapologetic authority. These images appear not once, but multiple times across the surviving fragments from this period, suggesting this was not some isolated artistic experiment, but a deliberate, repeated element of how the royal family wanted Nefertiti's authority to be understood and remembered by anyone who saw these temple walls. Some historians have looked at this image, along with the family altar scene that shows her seated on a throne decorated with the symbol representing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, normally an emblem reserved exclusively for the reigning king's own throne, and concluded that Nefertiti may have held a political status equal to, or in certain contexts perhaps even exceeding, that of her own husband, functioning not merely as his beloved wife, but as something approaching a genuine co-ruler, a second pharaoh standing alongside the first, her cartouche, the oval ring used to enclose royal names, appearing alongside her husband's own on official monuments with a frequency and prominence that separates her sharply from every queen who had come before her in the long history of the 18th dynasty. Reflective tone. This theory remains genuinely contested among Egyptologists, since the surviving evidence, however suggestive, never quite crosses the threshold into unambiguous certainty. This could imply, based on the pattern of increasingly kingly imagery surrounding Nefertiti as Akhenaten's reign progressed, that her authority grew steadily more formalized and more independent over time, evolving from the traditional role of a beloved royal consort into something considerably closer to genuine, shared sovereignty. But it remains entirely possible, based on the same fragmentary evidence, that these striking images represent something more symbolic than literal, a visual celebration of the Queen's spiritual and ceremonial importance to the new religion, rather than a genuine, formal transfer of pharaonic political authority, since Egyptian art throughout its long history frequently used symbolic, idealized imagery to communicate religious and cosmic truths, rather than literal, documentary records of actual political arrangements, meaning modern viewers accustomed to reading images as straightforward historical evidence may sometimes be tempted to overinterpret what ancient Egyptian artists intended as symbolic praise rather than administrative fact. What no historian seriously disputes is that Nefertiti occupied a position of visual and religious prominence that had no real precedent among the queens who came before her. A woman whose image appears across the surviving art of the Amarna period with a frequency and a confidence that rivals, and in some surviving fragments even exceeds, that of the pharaoh himself. Throughout these years of religious upheaval and radical civic reinvention, Nefertiti was also, in the most ordinary and human sense imaginable, raising a family. Vulnerability tone. She and Akhenaten had 6 daughters together across roughly a decade of marriage, beginning with their eldest, Meritaten, born before the end of the 2nd year of his reign, a girl who would eventually go on to play her own significant, still hotly debated role in the final years of the Amarna period, followed by Akhenaten a few years later, and then, after the move to the new capital, 4 more daughters in fairly rapid succession. Akhenaten, who would one day become the wife of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun himself under the changed name Akhenaten, Neferuaten Tesheret, Neferurah, and finally Setapenra, the youngest, each one given a name that, like their parents' own renamed identities, bound them linguistically and spiritually to the Aten their family now worshipped above all else. Bold statement tone. 6 daughters, and, as far as any surviving evidence can confirm, not a single son. A genuinely significant problem for any royal Egyptian family whose entire legitimacy traditionally rested on producing a male heir capable of inheriting the throne, and a gap in the historical record that would eventually help fuel some of the most persistent and most debated mysteries surrounding exactly what happened to Nefertiti and to her entire family once Akhenaten's reign began, inevitably to draw toward its close. The family scenes preserved in Amarna's art and in the private tombs of the city's officials paint a portrait of genuine, visible domestic warmth, an intimacy that stands in striking contrast to the formal, distant imagery that had typically characterized royal family portraiture in earlier periods of Egyptian history. Reflective tone. Daughters climb onto their parents' laps in these scenes, reach up to touch their mother's chin in gestures of childish affection, sit together at family meals depicted with an informality that Egyptian royal art had almost never permitted itself before. One particularly famous limestone relief showing Akhenaten leaning forward to kiss one of his daughters while another sits perched on Nefertiti's own lap, reaching up toward a dangling earring, small, unguarded human moments captured in stone with a tenderness that feels startlingly modern even across the vast gulf of more than 3,000 years. The kind of ordinary parental affection that any family in any era might instantly recognize. However unfamiliar the strange blue crowns, the elongated skulls, and the radiant sun disk hovering overhead might otherwise seem to modern eyes encountering this art for the very first time. Whatever theological, political, or even personal motivations actually drove Akhenaten's religious revolution, the art that survives from this period suggests a family that wanted, quite deliberately, to be seen loving one another, a radical departure not just in religious belief, but in how Egyptian royalty chose to present itself to its own people. And yet even this carefully constructed image of domestic happiness would not remain untouched by tragedy. Vulnerability tone. Sometime during these years at Amarna, the royal family's second daughter, Akhenaten, died, likely still only a child or a very young teenager, and the grief surrounding her death was recorded, remarkably, in a series of painted scenes inside the royal tomb at Amarna, images that show Akhenaten and Nefertiti standing together beside what appears to be Akhenaten's own body, their arms raised in visible gestures of mourning, one of the only surviving depictions anywhere in the entire span of ancient Egyptian royal art that shows a pharaoh and his queen caught in a moment of raw, unguarded personal grief rather than formal, ceremonial composure. Reflective tone. Egyptologists have long puzzled over another detail within these same mourning scenes, since one section appears to show a figure holding what looks like a newborn infant, standing near a nurse just outside the death chamber, a detail that has led some scholars to speculate that Akhenaten may have died in childbirth, still only a young teenager herself, impregnated, according to this theory, by her own father in keeping with certain incestuous marriage customs that some later members of this same royal family are known to have practiced. Marriages between close relatives that, however troubling to modern sensibilities, carried genuine religious and dynastic logic within the specific worldview of Egyptian royal ideology, which held that the purest divine bloodlines needed to be preserved through unions confined entirely within the royal family itself. This could imply, based on this fragmentary and genuinely disturbing visual evidence, a family tragedy considerably darker than a simple childhood illness. Though other historians caution that the infant figure in these scenes may instead represent something more symbolic, perhaps an image connected to the daughter's own rebirth into the afterlife, rather than literal evidence of a pregnancy, drawing on Egyptian funerary traditions that often depicted the deceased in the guise of the newborn sun god emerging each morning, reborn and renewed after passing through the darkness of night, and the true circumstances of Akhenaten's death remain. like so much else from this period, genuinely unresolved. It was a warning, though no one inside that carefully planned desert city could possibly have recognized it as one at the time, that even a family who believed themselves protected by the direct, personal favor of the sun itself remained just as vulnerable to loss, to mystery, and eventually to the same complete historical erasure that would soon swallow nearly everything they had built together. A foreshadowing of exactly how fragile this entire radical experiment, for all its grandeur and all its confident religious certainty, actually was, and of just how completely it would all come undone within only a handful more years. Somewhere around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, the carefully constructed world of Amarna began to unravel with a speed and a silence that historians are still struggling to fully explain. A collapse as sudden and as poorly documented as the meteoric rise that had preceded it only a decade or so earlier. Urgent tone, the written and artistic record which had documented Nefertiti's life in such vivid, repeated detail for over a decade, filling temple walls, private tombs, and household altars across the entire city with her image, simply stops. One of the royal daughters died. 3 others disappear from the historical record entirely, their fates never explained in any surviving text. Their names simply ceasing to appear in inscriptions and artwork from one year to the next without any accompanying explanation of what had actually become of them. And Nefertiti herself, the woman who had appeared in more surviving Egyptian artwork from this period than almost any other single human being, vanishes just as completely. Her name and image no longer appearing in the official record after this point, in any context historians can confidently identify. A silence so total and so abrupt that it stands in almost jarring contrast to the sheer volume of depictions that had documented her presence at court for well over a decade beforehand. Shocking fact tone. The simplest explanation, the one most Egyptologists default to when pressed, is also the most mundane, and it deserves serious consideration precisely because simple explanations, however less dramatic and less appealing to popular imagination, so often turn out to be the correct ones in matters of ancient history. Nefertiti died. Some kind of illness, perhaps even the same plague that scholars believe may have swept through the eastern Mediterranean world during this exact period. A pandemic referenced in surviving letters from neighboring kingdoms describing widespread death and devastation, with rulers as far away as the Hittite kingdom writing, decades later, of entire regions decimated by an unnamed sickness. One Hittite text describing a plague that persisted for as long as 20 years, and that Hittite scribes explicitly blamed on Egyptian prisoners of war brought back from campaigns fought during this exact turbulent period, that seemed to travel along the same trade routes and diplomatic channels connecting these great powers to one another, could easily have claimed her life along with those of her daughters, in an era when even members of the wealthiest, most powerful family on earth possessed no real defense against infectious disease, no understanding of contagion, and no medicine capable of treating whatever pathogen was actually responsible. Reflective tone. And yet this simple explanation, death by illness, sits uneasily alongside one deeply strange and persistent problem. A problem that has kept the mystery of Nefertiti's fate alive and hotly contested for well over a century. No body has ever been found. No tomb bearing her name has ever been conclusively identified, despite the fact that a royal tomb was indeed constructed at Amarna itself, cut into the eastern cliffs surrounding the city exactly as the boundary stele had promised, intended, according to its own decoration, to house Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their eldest daughter Meritaten together, its walls decorated with scenes of royal mourning and religious devotion that archaeologists have spent decades carefully documenting and interpreting. No funerary inscription describing her burial, no coffin bearing her name, no canopic jars holding her preserved organs, nothing that would normally accompany the death of an Egyptian queen of her stature has ever surfaced anywhere in the archaeological record, and even the royal tomb at Amarna itself, though clearly built with her burial in mind and decorated specifically to honor her anticipated presence there, shows no definitive evidence that she was ever actually interred there. Its inner chambers found largely empty by the archaeologists who eventually rediscovered and excavated the site in modern times. This could imply, based on this genuinely striking absence of any physical evidence for her death and burial, that the simple explanation may not tell the whole story. And it is this absence, more than any single piece of positive evidence, that has fueled decades of alternative theories about what actually happened to Nefertiti during these final, chaotic years of her husband's reign. The most compelling and most widely debated of these alternative theories holds that Nefertiti did not die at all, but instead transformed, at least in name and in official role, into something else entirely. Bold statement tone. Egyptologists have long known that in the final years of Akhenaten's reign, a mysterious figure appears in the historical record bearing the throne name Ankheperure Nefertiti, a name that incorporates, unmistakably, the very same additional title Nefertiti herself had adopted years earlier when she became Nefertiti, a naming overlap far too specific and far too unusual to easily dismiss as mere coincidence. One that has anchored an entire branch of Egyptological scholarship devoted specifically to untangling exactly what it might mean. This figure appears to have ruled as a co-regent alongside Akhenaten during his final years, and possibly continued ruling, briefly as sole pharaoh after his death, before Tutankhamun himself took the throne, with surviving inscriptions referring to this ruler using feminine grammatical forms in at least some contexts, a detail that has struck many Egyptologists as significant evidence that whoever bore this throne name was, in fact, a woman ruling in a traditionally masculine role, a grammatical quirk in the ancient Egyptian language that later scribes, working from earlier texts they were simply copying rather than composing fresh, may have preserved without fully realizing its significance, inadvertently leaving behind a small but genuine linguistic fingerprint of a female pharaoh hiding within the historical record. Question hook, mysterious tone. So who was this person? Was Nefertiti herself hiding in plain sight this entire time? Not dead at all, but elevated, in the final crisis of her husband's reign, to the unprecedented status of a genuine official co-ruler, a woman wearing, in at least some surviving depictions, the full regalia and titles of a king, the very crowns and royal costume that Egyptian art had, for the entire preceding history of the civilization, reserved almost exclusively for men. Reflective tone. This theory would explain, elegantly, both her disappearance from the historical record under her old name and titles, and the complete absence of any burial evidence under that same name, since a woman who had transformed into Nefertiti would naturally be commemorated, and eventually buried, under her new royal identity rather than her old one, a pattern of royal renaming and re-identification that Egyptian history had already demonstrated on multiple prior occasions, particularly when a monarch's status or role within the ruling family changed significantly during the course of their own lifetime. This could imply, based on the striking naming overlap between Nefertiti's own additional title and this mysterious co-regent's throne name, that the two women were indeed one and the same. A queen who had spent years cultivating an image of quasi-royal, near-pharaonic authority, finally receiving the full formal recognition that her husband's failing health and increasingly precarious political position made suddenly, urgently necessary, a natural culmination of the very trajectory her career had already been following since those first solo appearances performing priestly rituals inside the hoped Benben years earlier. A queen who had spent the better part of 2 decades slowly, deliberately expanding the boundaries of what an Egyptian royal wife was permitted to do and to represent, until formal recognition as a genuine co-ruler became less a dramatic break from her established pattern of behavior than its logical, inevitable conclusion. Shocking fact tone. But the theory runs into genuine complications the moment you look closely at the evidence, because several surviving inscriptions from this same period also mention a completely different figure, a co-regent bearing the name Smenkhkare, a name that appears alongside Akhenaten's own in ways that suggest, at least on the surface, an entirely separate individual, quite possibly male, holding a position of similarly elevated authority during these same chaotic final years, with at least one surviving object, a small ornamental box, actually bearing both the Nefertiti and Smenkhkare names together in a way that has only deepened, rather than resolved the confusion surrounding exactly how these two royal identities actually related to one another. For decades, some historians have argued that Nefertiti and Smenkhkare must be one and the same person as well. That Nefertiti essentially adopted first one royal identity and then another as her own power and titles evolved during this turbulent period, discarding her original name entirely in favor of an increasingly masculine, increasingly kingly royal persona. A transformation that would represent one of the most dramatic acts of political and personal reinvention undertaken by any monarch, male or female, anywhere in the entire recorded history of ancient Egypt. Bold statement tone. Other Egyptologists reject this theory just as firmly, arguing instead that Smenkhkare was a genuinely separate person entirely, quite possibly a younger brother or a son of Akhenaten from a secondary wife, a young man who briefly held power alongside, or perhaps even married to, Akhenaten's own eldest daughter Meritaten, before dying young himself and making way for the boy who would become Tutankhamun, a scenario that would mean 2 entirely different co-regents, one female and one male, held power in rapid succession during these final chaotic years, each one contributing separately to the tangled, contradictory web of royal names and titles that has confused historians ever since. Some scholars have gone even further, suggesting that Meritaten herself may have held genuine political power during this period, perhaps ruling briefly in her own right, or serving as the power behind whichever co-regent actually occupied the throne. A theory that would mean not one, but potentially 2 generations of powerful royal women, mother and daughter both, held real authority during the final collapse of the Amarna experiment, an inheritance of political ambition and religious authority passed down, however briefly and however incompletely documented, from one remarkable woman to the next during the very years when the entire system that had elevated them both was crumbling around them. Reflective tone. This entire tangle of overlapping names, uncertain genders, and possibly conflated identities represents, in the words of more than one exasperated Egyptologist over the decades, one of the single most confusing and contested puzzles in the entire study of ancient Egypt. A puzzle made even more difficult by the fact that Egyptian royal names were frequently altered, recycled, and reassigned during moments of political transition, meaning that the same physical objects, the same statues and inscriptions, could sometimes be modified and relabeled multiple times as circumstances at court shifted. A coffin originally carved for one royal figure, sometimes reused and reinscribed for an entirely different one only years later, leaving modern researchers to try to untangle layers of ancient editorial revision, working with only fragmentary, damaged evidence separated from us by more than 3,000 years. Evidence that has itself been chipped, defaced, and deliberately altered by later rulers pursuing their own political agendas. This could imply, based on the genuinely contradictory nature of the surviving evidence, that we may never achieve full certainty about exactly how many distinct people actually held power during these final years of the Amarna period, or about which of these mysterious names, if any, actually belonged to Nefertiti herself in her final act of political reinvention. What virtually every historian studying this period does agree upon is that these years, whatever the precise cast of characters actually involved, represented a period of genuine crisis and instability at the very top of the Egyptian state. A scramble for legitimacy and continued authority happening in the shadow of Akhenaten's own declining health and the mounting internal pressure, from priests, officials, and ordinary Egyptians alike, to abandon his radical religious experiment entirely and return to the traditional gods that had sustained the civilization for well over 1,000 years before his own controversial reign began. A pressure that had likely been building quietly for years before finally boiling over into the open political chaos these final, confusing years of the Amarna period so clearly represent. Akhenaten himself died sometime around the 17th year of his reign, and the throne, after this brief and still deeply confusing period of transition, ultimately passed to a child. Urgent tone. The boy who ascended to power, originally named Tutankhaten, honoring the very god his family had spent nearly 2 decades exclusively worshipping, was likely no older than 8 or 9 years old at the time of his coronation, a child entirely unprepared to navigate the immense political and religious pressures now bearing down on the fragile, radical experiment his father had built. Modern attesting has established that Tutankhamun's own parents were almost certainly Akhenaten himself, and one of Akhenaten's own sisters, rather than Nefertiti, meaning that despite Nefertiti's prominent role at court and her position as Akhenaten's chief wife, the boy who would eventually inherit the throne was not, biologically, her own son at all, a genetic reality that adds yet another layer of complexity to an already tangled family tree, one that historians and geneticists alike continue to untangle strand by strand using tools and techniques that no archaeologist working in Borchart's own era could ever have imagined possible. Vulnerability tone. It is worth pausing to consider what this young boy's early life must actually have been like, born into a family whose entire identity had been built around a single, all-consuming religious revolution, watching that world collapse around him just as he reached an age old enough to begin understanding it. Robbed of any real childhood by the crushing weight of a throne he had never asked for, and could not possibly have been prepared to occupy, surrounded by powerful advisors, quite possibly including the very man historians believe may have been his own grandfather by marriage. Who understood with total clarity that Egypt's broader population, its powerful priesthood, and its unsettled bureaucracy could not tolerate a continuation of the Amarna experiment for very much longer. Within a few short years of taking the throne, the young king abandoned the city of Amarna entirely, moved his court back to the traditional capital region around Thebes, and, in a decision of enormous symbolic significance, changed his own name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, replacing his devotion to the Aten with a public, permanent restoration of loyalty to Amun, the very god his father had spent his entire adult reign working to suppress. His young wife, Akhenaten, Nefertiti's own third daughter, changing her name in parallel fashion to Akhenaten, a matched pair of name changes that mirrored, in miniature, the very same kind of coordinated religious rebranding her own parents had once undertaken together decades earlier. Though moving in precisely the opposite theological direction, back toward the very traditions Nefertiti and Akhenaten had once worked so hard to overturn. Bold statement tone. A formal proclamation issued during his reign, known today as the Restoration Stela, describes the temples of the traditional gods as having fallen into a state of near ruin during the preceding years. Their sanctuaries overgrown, their statues damaged, their priesthoods scattered and unpaid. The very gods themselves, according to the inscription's own dramatic language, having turned their backs on the land of Egypt because of the neglect they had suffered, withdrawing their protection so completely that the stela describes armies sent to the country's borders achieving no success whatsoever, and prayers offered to any god or goddess going entirely unanswered, and it credits the young king with personally restoring their proper worship, rebuilding their physical structures, refilling their treasuries, and reinstating the traditional religious order that his father had so thoroughly dismantled. Reflective tone. Whether this inscription accurately reflects the genuine physical condition of Egypt's temples after less than 2 decades of neglect, or whether it exaggerates the scale of the crisis for propaganda purposes, meant to cast the young king's restoration in the most dramatic and flattering light possible, remains a matter of some scholarly debate, though there is little doubt that the underlying religious and political reversal it describes was entirely genuine and entirely consequential for the fate of everyone still associated with the fallen Amarna experiment. Tutankhamun himself died young, still only in his late teens, his own death surrounded by persistent theories of injury, illness, and even, in some more sensational popular accounts, outright murder, a theory fueled partly by an early X-ray analysis conducted decades ago that seemed to show a possible skull injury, though modern medical analysis of his mummy using far more sophisticated CT. Scanning technology has generally pointed toward natural causes instead, possibly complicated by a broken leg that appears to have become severely infected shortly before his death, combined with a serious malarial infection discovered through genetic testing of his remains. A combination of a compromised immune system and an untreated fracture that, in an era without antibiotics or modern medical intervention, could very plausibly have proven fatal even to a young man who otherwise appeared, based on the general condition of his skeleton, to have been in reasonably good health. Shocking fact tone. With Tutankhamun's own early death, and with no surviving son of his own to inherit the throne, power passed first to the aging courtier A, the very man many historians believe was Nefertiti's own father, who ruled briefly in his own right as pharaoh, reportedly marrying Tutankhamun's own young widow, Akhenaten, in order to legitimize his claim to a throne he had no direct hereditary right to occupy. A marriage that, if the theory of A's paternity is correct, would have meant an elderly man marrying his own granddaughter. One final, deeply strange twist in a family tree already tangled, almost beyond untangling, by generations of intermarriage and dynastic necessity, completing an almost unbelievable journey from provincial nobleman to father-in-law of one king and possible grandfather-in-law of another, before finally, in the final act of his own extraordinarily long life, becoming king of Egypt himself. His reign, too, proved brief, lasting only about 4 years, and the throne passed next to a hardened military commander named Horemheb, a man who had served as a general throughout the turbulent Amarna years, holding significant command over Egypt's army even during Tutankhamun's own reign, having already been positioned by the boy king's advisors as heir presumptive before A ultimately claimed that role for himself, a slight Horemheb apparently never forgot, and who now, finally holding supreme power himself, set out to accomplish something considerably more ambitious than merely restoring the old gods to their proper place. Bold statement tone. Horemheb decided that the entire Amarna episode, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and every single ruler connected in any way to this catastrophic religious and political detour, needed to be erased from Egyptian history entirely. Not merely defeated or superseded, but genuinely, deliberately forgotten. As though this entire quarter century of Egyptian history had simply never happened at all. An ambition so total that it very nearly succeeded, surviving as effectively as it did for over 3,000 years, until modern archaeology finally began, piece by painstaking piece, to reverse it. This process, which modern historians borrow a Latin term to describe, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was pursued with remarkable systematic thoroughness, reflecting a genuine Egyptian religious belief that erasing a person's name could actually damage their eternal soul, since the preservation of one's name was considered essential to surviving in the afterlife. The Egyptians believing that a person effectively died a second, final death, the moment their name was spoken or written for the very last time. Meaning this campaign of erasure was not merely a political statement, but, in the worldview of the people carrying it out, an act of genuine spiritual punishment inflicted upon the dead. A curse considered far more devastating than any physical destruction of tombs or monuments could ever achieve on its own. Urgent tone. Horemheb's workmen fanned out across Egypt, chiseling Akhenaten's name and image out of monuments wherever they found it, dismantling the Talatat block temples at Karnak entirely, and reusing the small, easily portable stones as ordinary building material for entirely unrelated construction projects, packed by the thousands into the cores of later pylons and gateways where they served as nothing. More than convenient, structurally useful rubble fill, a fate that, in a bitter historical irony, actually helped preserve thousands of these decorated blocks intact, buried for centuries inside later pylons and walls until modern archaeologists began carefully extracting and reassembling them in the 20th century, piecing together fragments of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's own temple decorations, from stones that had spent well over 3,000 years hidden inside the very monuments built to erase their memory. A slow, painstaking process of archaeological reconstruction that continues, block by block, even today. Reflective tone. Later Egyptian king lists compiled during subsequent dynasties, official chronological records of legitimate pharaohs meant to be recited during religious ceremonies honoring royal ancestors, simply skip directly from Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, straight to Horemheb himself, omitting an entire quarter century of Egyptian history and every ruler associated with it, including Nefertiti, as though this entire chapter of the civilization's story had been surgically removed, a piece of deliberate historical revisionism so successful that a king list carved into a temple wall at Abydos less than a century after Akhenaten's own death makes no mention of him whatsoever, as though the man had simply never existed at all. This could imply, based on how completely and how deliberately this erasure was carried out, why so little concrete information about Nefertiti's actual life and death survived into later periods at all, and why it would take the arrival of modern archaeology and the accidental rediscovery of a buried, half-forgotten desert city, to bring her story back into the light after more than 3,000 years of officially enforced silence. Given this deliberate historical erasure, and given the total absence of any confirmed tomb or burial, the search for Nefertiti's actual physical remains has occupied Egyptologists for well over a century, a search that has produced several tantalizing, ultimately unsatisfying candidates. Shocking fact tone. In 1898, decades before the famous bust would even be discovered, a French archaeologist named Victor Loret, exploring a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV-35, originally built for an earlier pharaoh named Amenhotep II, whose own remarkably well-preserved mummy still lay undisturbed within the tomb's main burial chamber, found something unexpected while exploring further into the complex. A side chamber containing a small collection of royal mummies that had apparently been moved there in antiquity, likely by priests seeking to protect valuable royal remains from a wave of tomb robbery that plagued Egypt during a later, more chaotic period of its history. A common practice known to Egyptologists as caching, in which threatened royal bodies were gathered together and reburied in whatever secure location remained available, often stripped of much of their original golden treasure by the very officials tasked with protecting them. A phenomenon that has left modern archaeologists with dozens of royal mummies recovered not from their original individually prepared tombs, but from these later, more chaotic mass reburial sites, their original identifying inscriptions sometimes lost or damaged in the process of being moved and reburied under emergency conditions by priests working, in some cases, more than 2 centuries after the original burial had taken place. A grim testament to just how thoroughly organized tomb robbery had become in Egypt by this later period. An entire underground economy built around plundering the very royal burials that Egyptian religion considered sacred and inviolable. Among these mummies were 2 unidentified women, who came to be known, for lack of any better identification, simply as the elder lady and the younger lady, their names, ranks, and precise identities lost somewhere in the intervening 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Their bodies stripped of the identifying coffins and inscriptions that would ordinarily have made their identification a straightforward matter for the archaeologists who eventually found them. For decades, speculations swirled around both of these unnamed bodies, each one considered, at various points, a potential candidate for the lost Nefertiti. Bold statement tone. The elder lady's candidacy was finally resolved in 1976, when a lock of hair found sealed inside a small coffin within Tutankhamun's own tomb. A tiny, exquisitely made miniature coffin that had puzzled archaeologists ever since Howard Carter first discovered it decades earlier. Buried among the boy king's own personal funerary equipment, for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious in their own right. A coffin explicitly labelled with the name of Queen Tiye was compared against the mummy's own remaining hair, and found to match closely enough, in texture and structure, that most Egyptologists now accept the elder lady as Tai herself, Akhenaten's mother and Nefertiti's own mother-in-law, rather than Nefertiti, a conclusion later strengthened by additional genetic testing conducted decades afterward. The younger lady's identity proved considerably more contested and considerably more dramatic. In 2003, a British Egyptologist named Joan Fletcher announced, with considerable media fanfare including an accompanying television documentary broadcast to audiences around the world, that she believed the younger lady was in fact Nefertiti herself, pointing to details including a specific, distinctive hairstyle preserved on the mummy's own shaved and remodeled head. a style she argued was consistent with the kind of elaborate wig Nefertiti was known to wear beneath her tall blue crown, a double-pierced ear that she argued matched patterns visible in Nefertiti's own artistic representations, and even a bared, exposed breast on the unwrapped mummy that Fletcher connected to certain suggestive artistic depictions of the Queen from Amarna itself, arguing that this particular combination of physical details, taken together, pointed toward a royal woman of considerable status and considerable personal vanity about her own appearance even in death. The announcement generated exactly the kind of international attention its dramatic presentation seemed designed to produce. Newspapers around the world running the story under breathless headlines proclaiming that the lost queen had finally been found. A claim that circulated for months in popular media, even as more cautious voices within the Egyptological community urged patience until more rigorous scientific testing could actually be carried out, since hairstyle and ear-piercing patterns, however visually suggestive, fell well short of the kind of conclusive proof such an extraordinary claim genuinely required. Reflective tone. This announcement provoked immediate and considerable pushback from other Egyptologists, including Zahi Hawass, then Egypt's leading antiquities official, who organized a formal dinar testing program specifically to resolve the question once and for all, a decision that reflected growing institutional frustration within Egypt itself at how frequently sensational. Unverified claims about the country's ancient heritage circulated internationally without proper scientific scrutiny. Bringing in a team of geneticists to extract and analyze genetic material from several of the unidentified Amarna period mummies stored in Egyptian museum collections. A multi-year project that also examined questions of family relationships across the entire Amarna royal family, comparing genetic markers between numerous mummies believed to be connected to this same turbulent generation of Egyptian rulers. Shocking fact tone. The results, when they finally arrived in 2010, definitively ruled Nefertiti out. Genetic analysis confirmed that the younger lady was, in fact, the biological mother of Tutankhamun himself, and, more surprisingly still, that she was also the full sister of Tutankhamun's own father, meaning this mummy represented a full sibling of Akhenaten rather than his wife. Almost certainly one of the daughters of Amenhotep III and Queen Taye, whose specific individual name has never been definitively established in the surviving historical record. This could imply, based on this genetic evidence, that Tutankhamun's actual parentage involved a level of close, sibling-level incest within the royal family that even by the standards of Egyptian royal marriage customs was considered unusually intimate, a practice Egyptologists believe was reserved almost exclusively for the very core of the reigning dynasty in order to preserve what was considered a uniquely divine bloodline distinct from that of any ordinary Egyptian family, a religious and genealogical logic that modern medical science now understands carried severe genetic risks that some researchers have specifically connected to Tutankhamun's own documented physical ailments, including a clubfoot and evidence of bone necrosis found during CT scanning of his mummy. Conditions that may well have resulted from generations of exactly this kind of close royal intermarriage, a detail that reshaped historians' understanding of exactly how Tutankhamun fit into this complicated, tangled family tree, while simultaneously closing off, at least for the moment, one of the most promising physical leads anyone had ever developed in the search for Nefertiti's actual body. Nefertiti's own body, wherever it may actually rest, has never been conclusively identified among any of the mummies recovered from the Valley of the Kings or anywhere else in Egypt, and the search, remarkably, continues even now, more than a century after archaeologists first began seriously looking. While her body remained lost, Nefertiti's face returned to the world in spectacular fashion in the winter of 1912, when a German archaeological team, led by Ludwig Borchardt, excavating the ruins of Amarna on behalf of an organization called the German Oriental Company, funded by a wealthy Prussian businessman and philanthropist named James Simon, whose extensive personal fortune underwrote a significant share of German archaeological work in Egypt and Mesopotamia during this era, and whose own extraordinary generosity toward Berlin's museums would eventually see thousands of artifacts he personally financed enter German public collections, uncovered the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose, a man who had carried the prestigious title the King's Favorite and Master of Works, indicating just how highly regarded his artistic talents had been during his own lifetime, an assessment the surviving quality of his work has done nothing to diminish across the more than 3,000 years separating his own era from ours. Bold statement tone. On the 6th of December 1912, Borchardt's workers cleared away rubble inside one of the workshop's rooms and found, lying face down, still partially embedded in the earth, an extraordinarily well-preserved painted bust, its blue crown and delicately modelled features so lifelike that Borchardt, writing in his excavation diary that same evening, could only manage a single, famously understated line. That description was useless, that the piece simply had to be seen to be believed. Mini-story tone. Picture the scene inside that dusty excavation room, workers carefully clearing away centuries of accumulated sand and debris, when suddenly, at knee-height, a skin-colored neck adorned with painted red ribbons began to emerge from the rubble, followed slowly, painstakingly, by the delicate curve of a chin, the graceful line of a painted eyebrow, and finally, the full, unmistakable face of a queen who had lain buried and forgotten for well over 3,000 years, waiting silently inside a ruined workshop for the exact moment modern archaeology would finally be ready to bring her back into the light. Shocking fact tone. The bust itself, standing just under 20 inches tall and crafted from a limestone core covered in painted stucco, bears no identifying inscription anywhere on its surface, yet its identity as Nefertiti has never been seriously disputed, since the distinctive flat-topped blue crown it wears matches other clearly labeled depictions of the queen found elsewhere at Amarna, including the intimate family altar scene showing her with Akhenaten and their daughters. One curious mystery has puzzled researchers and visitors alike since the very day of the discovery. The bust's left eye, unlike its right, contains no inlaid quartz iris at all, an asymmetry Borchardt originally assumed reflected a piece that had simply fallen out and been lost sometime after the workshop's abandonment, prompting him to even offer a substantial reward, a considerable sum at the time, to anyone who could locate the missing fragment, though careful searching of the surrounding debris at the time of discovery, and repeated searches in the decades since, never turned up any trace of the missing inlay, leading many scholars to conclude instead that the bust was never actually completed, that the missing eye may have been deliberately left absent so that master sculptor Thutmose could use the piece as a teaching tool, demonstrating to his own students the precise anatomical construction required to properly carve an inlaid eye socket before the delicate, expensive final step of adding the colored stone inlay itself, meaning the world's most famous ancient Egyptian portrait may, in fact, never have been intended as a finished work of art at all, but rather as a kind of master template, a study piece meant purely for the sculptor's own workshop rather than public display. Reflective tone. The bust's journey from that Egyptian workshop to its current home in a Berlin museum has itself become the subject of considerable controversy. one that continues to strain relations between Egypt and Germany to this day. Under the excavation agreements common in this era, foreign archaeological teams working in Egypt were required to split their discoveries with Egyptian antiquities authorities in a process known as parentage, a system meant to ensure that host countries retained a fair share of whatever treasures foreign expeditions happened to unearth on their soil. An arrangement that had governed foreign excavation across Egypt for decades, and that generally functioned, at least in theory, as a reasonably equitable compromise between the financial and logistical burden foreign teams shouldered and Egypt's own legitimate claim to its ancient heritage. And it was during this division of the 1912 finds that accusations of deception first arose. This could imply, based on documentation that later came to light, including internal correspondence from within the German Oriental Company itself, that Borchardt deliberately downplayed the bust's true magnificence to the Egyptian officials overseeing the division, reportedly showing them an unflattering photograph of the piece taken in poor lighting, and describing its material inaccurately as ordinary gypsum, rather than the finer limestone and stucco combination it was actually made from, ensuring that this particular treasure ended up categorized among Germany's share of the discoveries rather than Egypt's, while the French inspector overseeing the division on Egypt's behalf apparently never bothered to personally lift the bust from its box, to examine it more closely for himself. The bust remained largely out of public view for over a decade after its discovery, only going on formal public display in Berlin in 1923, and Egypt has been requesting its return ever since that first public unveiling made clear exactly what had left the country. Bold statement tone. Even Adolf Hitler, according to surviving British diplomatic records, personally intervened to block a potential repatriation deal being negotiated in the late 1920s, one that had reportedly reached an advanced enough stage that both German and Egyptian officials believed an exchange of other valuable antiquities in return for the bust's release might finally succeed, reportedly declaring that he would never give up the head of the Queen, and that he intended, according to some accounts, to eventually build an entire museum specifically to house it as a centerpiece of German cultural prestige. A statement that added a particularly dark chapter to an already contentious ownership dispute that remains entirely unresolved to this day. With the bust still standing in Berlin's Neues Museum, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, its own dedicated gallery kept at carefully controlled temperature and humidity levels to protect the fragile stucco surface from any further deterioration, while Egyptian officials, including former antiquities chief Zahi Hawass, continue to argue publicly and repeatedly that one of their nation's most important cultural treasures belongs, rightfully, back on Egyptian soil, a demand German museum authorities have consistently rejected, citing the bust's extreme fragility and the genuine risk that moving it could cause irreparable damage to a piece of stucco and limestone that has already survived more than 3,000 years, a scientific concern that Egyptian officials counter by pointing to the many other equally fragile ancient artifacts that have been safely transported internationally for major museum exhibitions without incident. The mystery of where Nefertiti's actual body might be hidden took a dramatic modern turn in 2015, when a British Egyptologist named Nicholas Reeves, carefully studying high-resolution laser scans and detailed color photography of the walls inside Tutankhamun's own tomb, commissioned years earlier by a digital preservation organization called Factum Arte, announced a startling hypothesis. Shocking fact tone. Reeves noticed what he believed were faint traces of sealed doorways hidden beneath the painted plaster of the tomb's north and west walls, perfectly straight vertical lines that seemed, to his trained eye, to correspond to the outline of partition walls and blocked entrances rather than mere natural cracking or ordinary construction seams. Features he first identified not through direct physical examination, but through painstaking study of the black and white texture scans that stripped away the tomb's famous painted scenes to reveal the underlying surface irregularities of the wall itself. A method of analysis that highlighted structural details invisible to the naked eye of any previous visitor, including Howard Carter himself. And he proposed something genuinely audacious, that Tutankhamun's tomb, famously discovered almost completely intact by Howard Carter in 1922, after decades of fruitless searching by other archaeologists, had not originally been built for Tutankhamun at all, but had instead been constructed years earlier as the intended burial place for Nefertiti herself, who Reeves believed had indeed ruled briefly as a female pharaoh under the name Ankheperure Neferuaten. When Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at a young age with no tomb of his own yet completed, Reeves argued his advisors had hastily requisitioned Nefertiti's already prepared burial chambers for the young king's own interment, sealing off and plastering over the sections that would have led to her still intact, still undiscovered burial deeper within the same tomb complex. A theory that would also help explain why Tutankhamun's own tomb felt, to several Egyptologists who had studied its unusual layout over the decades, distinctly smaller and more modestly proportioned than would typically be expected for a reigning king, more consistent, Reeves argued, with the kind of burial chamber originally intended for a queen, its entrance positioned unusually far to the right rather than centered in the customary manner of other royal tombs from this same general period, and its overall floor plan bearing what Reeves considered telltale similarities to other confirmed queens' tombs elsewhere in the Valley of the Kings, similarities he argued no previous scholar had ever bothered to systematically compare before his own detailed architectural analysis brought them to wider attention. Urgent tone. This theory generated an extraordinary wave of international excitement, and the Egyptian government, working with a Japanese radar specialist named Hirokatsu Watanabe, conducted an initial ground-penetrating radar survey of the tomb in November of 2015, followed by infrared thermography scans that detected an area of unusually elevated heat behind one of the painted walls, a temperature anomaly that seemed, at first glance, to support the presence of some kind of hidden void space beyond. The results seemed genuinely promising. Egypt's Antiquities Minister announced, with considerable confidence, that there was a 90% likelihood of hidden chambers existing behind the painted walls, and headlines around the world speculated that the lost queen might finally be found. Museums and news outlets across the globe running breathless coverage of what many were already calling the archaeological discovery of the century. Tourism officials in Egypt reportedly already anticipating a significant surge in visitors eager to witness what might become one of the most important archaeological finds in decades. Reflective tone. But the excitement proved premature. A second radar survey, conducted the following year by an entirely separate team, failed to replicate the original findings, and the specialized equipment used in the first survey had been modified by its own operator in ways he claimed made it impossible for anyone else to properly verify or reinterpret the raw data. An unusual and frustrating complication for what should have been a straightforward scientific question, since Watanabe declined to release his complete underlying data for independent review by other radar specialists. This could imply, based on the growing scientific caution surrounding the original findings, that the initial results may have reflected wishful interpretation as much as genuine physical evidence. A not uncommon pitfall in archaeological research, where the desire to find something extraordinary can sometimes color the interpretation of genuinely ambiguous data. Though Reeves himself continued to defend his hypothesis publicly for years afterward, publishing further analysis of the tomb's artistic and architectural details in support of his theory. A third and considerably more rigorous radar survey, conducted in 2018 by an Italian research team using multiple overlapping frequency bands and far denser spatial sampling than either of the earlier attempts, found no evidence whatsoever of any hidden chambers or sealed doorways anywhere adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb. A conclusion published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal specifically dedicated to cultural heritage research. The researchers noting explicitly that their much more sensitive equipment detected none of the discontinuities between natural bedrock and artificial blocking walls that would necessarily be present if a genuine sealed chamber actually existed behind the painted plaster. Bold statement tone. Most Egyptologists today consider the hidden chamber hypothesis effectively disproven, a conclusion that Reeves himself has resisted accepting entirely, continuing to point toward the artistic and architectural anomalies he originally identified as still meaningful even in the absence of radar confirmation. A scientific disagreement that continues to play out in academic journals and conference presentations, even years after the initial excitement of 2015, has largely faded from public memory, but one that has led the broader scholarly community to largely set the theory aside, leaving the search for Nefertiti's actual resting place exactly where it had been before Reeves's dramatic 2015 announcement, unresolved, and seemingly no closer to a definitive answer than it had been for the previous century. Reflective tone. It is worth pausing here to consider why this particular ancient mystery has captured public imagination so completely, generating international headlines and museum crowds in a way that the fates of countless other ancient Egyptian queens, women whose lives are equally poorly documented, somehow never managed to achieve. Women whose own names and stories, however historically significant they may once have been, simply never captured the same kind of enduring cultural fascination that Nefertiti's own story has sustained across more than a century of continuous public interest. Part of the answer surely lies in that extraordinary bust itself. A face so vivid and so hauntingly present that it seems to demand a story, a resolution, an ending that matches the intensity of its own visual power, a piece of art so effective at conveying a sense of living, breathing personality across a gap of more than 3,000 years that modern viewers find it almost impossible to look at it as merely an archaeological artifact rather than a genuine encounter with another human being. But part of the answer also lies in the genuine, substantive evidence for Nefertiti's own political significance during her lifetime. The mace-wielding imagery, the solo temple worship, the equal-scale portraiture, evidence substantial enough to suggest that whatever actually happened to her in those final chaotic years of the Amarna period, she was, during the years we can actually document with confidence, one of the most powerful women who ever lived in the ancient world, a queen whose authority came remarkably close to rivaling that of the king beside her, a woman whose actual, documented historical significance would already be extraordinary, even without the added mystery of her uncertain end, and whose case demonstrates just how much genuine power an Egyptian queen could accumulate under the right combination of personal ambition, religious upheaval, and a husband willing to share his own divine status more completely than any pharaoh, before or after him. Bold statement tone. In the more than a century since her rediscovery, Nefertiti has become something considerably larger than a historical figure confined to academic journals and museum placards. Her rediscovery in 1912 marking not an ending to her story, but, in a strange and fitting way, an entirely new beginning. A second life, lived in the imagination of millions of people who would otherwise have had no reason to know her name at all. She has become a genuine cultural icon, invoked as a symbol of feminine power, of beauty transcending its own historical moment, and, for many modern observers, of a woman who may have wielded genuine political authority in a world that offered vanishingly few such opportunities to women of any station. Her image reproduced on everything from high-fashion runways to popular tattoo designs. Her name attached to museum exhibitions, novels, and documentaries produced in dozens of languages across every continent on Earth. Referenced by musicians, filmmakers, and visual artists who have never studied a single page of Egyptological scholarship, yet instinctively understand exactly what her image represents. Reflective tone. Whether this modern reputation fully matches the historical reality remains, like so much else about her, genuinely uncertain, since so much of what we think we know about Nefertiti rests on inference, on careful reading of fragmentary art and even more fragmentary text, rather than the kind of direct, unambiguous documentary evidence historians would ideally prefer. A gap between popular legend and documented fact that Egyptologists continue working patiently to narrow with each new discovery, each new scan, each new piece of evidence carefully extracted from the sand of a country that has already kept this particular secret remarkably well for well over 3,000 years. But perhaps this very uncertainty is part of what makes her story endure so powerfully across more than 3,000 years. She lived through one of the most radical religious and political experiments in the entire history of the ancient world, stood beside a husband determined to remake an entire civilization's relationship with the divine, raised 6 daughters inside a city built from nothing in the middle of the desert, watched at least one of those daughters grow up to inherit a throne of her own, achieved a level of visual and religious prominence that no Egyptian queen before her had ever approached, buried at least one of her own children far too young, watched her husband's entire life's work collapse within a handful of years of his death, witnessed the very city she had called home for over a decade eventually abandoned entirely and left to crumble back into the desert sand from which it had risen, and then, in the final act of her own story, simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a face carved in stone, and a question that, after more than a century of dedicated searching by some of the most brilliant archaeologists in the world, no one has yet been able to definitively answer. Reflective tone. Perhaps that unanswered question is, in its own strange way, a fitting final chapter for a woman whose entire life seems to have been defined by a kind of luminous, unresolved intensity. A queen who burned brightly enough in her own moment to leave behind one of the most recognizable faces in all of human history, and yet vanished completely enough that even now, 33 centuries later, she continues to slip through our fingers every time we believe we have finally, truly found her. A mystery that each new generation of archaeologists inherits fresh, certain that the tools and technology now available to them will finally succeed where every previous attempt has fallen short. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, walking through the extraordinary, unresolved, and endlessly fascinating story of the beautiful one who came, and who then, just as mysteriously, vanished. If her story captivated you, let me know in the comments which theory about her disappearance you find most convincing, and I will see you in the next one.